Thanks so much for agreeing to be interviewed. I'm really excited about this book, Year of the Dog. And I've actually shared it with a lot of people already. So I've shared it with students, I've even shared it with my family. And it does such good work contextualizing this family story in a greater social landscape.
Thank you.
Yeah, I really love this book. So for folks who haven't had the chance to read this book yet, it really combines this like lush array of different media and modalities. So we have traditional text, experimental text, visuals, personal photographs, also like iconic photographs from the early 70s, and then snippets of text from letters. So I just, think that it's like a great tool for sharing with creative writing students. And it also occurred to me that it would be really fun to study this book with high school students who are studying the 60s and 70s. And as a reader, I felt like I had entered like a library or a museum. There was just like so much to look at, so much to engage with. So I'm wondering if you would start out by reading a poem from the book for us. And I have a reader request.
Sure. Happy to take requests.
Cool. Would you read Self-Portrait in Flesh and Stone, page 23, I think?
Absolutely. This is one of the poems that really, and we can talk about this later, unlocked so much of the bigger book for me. So here we go. Self-Portrait in Flesh and Stone. Before the war, my father slid shoehorns between the lips of discount loafers and socked heels. If the shoe fits, so the story goes, the true identity of the cinder-shrouded girl is known. Persephone swallowed the seeds and her mother bent, fallowed. My father's mother had 9 mouths to feed, 10 if she counted herself. Cronus ate his first 5 kids and then a stone. The memorial is cut from polished black granite and cuts into the earth. My father's name is not cut into the stone, but still I see my reflection in its surface. I tell you, it says in the book of Luke, if these remain silent, the stones would cry out. My father used to have a mouth on him, but now he reads the Bible and doesn't cuss. Soldiers in the trenches pass the time sucking on cigarettes and the occasional fruitcake from home until their mouths clouded with rot, and they called this trench mouth. The 56th Dental Detachment Fubai Dental Clinic was the name of my father's unit. A dentist once said to Gloria Anzaldúa, we're going to have to do something about your tongue. I inherited my father's gutter mouth, which is not the same as trench mouth. Soldiers dug 25,000 miles of trenches along the Western Front. The Viet Cong required North Vietnamese villagers to dig 3 feet of the Cu Chi tunnels each day, and this is where they burrowed to escape the bombs bursting in air. I once pulled myself out of a depression by swallowing herbs and walking each day down the thin slit that cut across the winter-stripped field. Persephone pulled the narcissus from its root and the dark mouth sucked her down. There's a photo of my father pulling a rotten tooth from the mouth of a Vietnamese boy. The trenches would flood and the soldiers would stand for long stretches in the muck, unable to remove their wet socks and boots, and their feet would soften to rot, and they called this trench foot. I put my foot in my mouth nearly every day. Gloria Anzaldúa asks questions that are really refusals. How do you tame a wild tongue? How do you bridle and saddle it? How do you make it lie down? In a 1969 photograph by Horst Voss, a young South Vietnamese woman covers her opened mouth as she stares into a mass grave where she fears her father's body lies. Many mammals will eat the placenta of their newborns, but some Mexican women I know bury theirs near the hearth. In 1967, Dang Thi Long sang and danced and cooked and crawled and dug with a short hoe and gave birth to her daughter in the Cu Chi tunnels. Cronus devoured his children, and still his son came back and cast him down. The soldiers would hump through the monsoon-soaked marsh until their feet bloomed with jungle rot. My body and my father's body and Plath's body, headstone quiet, jostled by nothing, only the mouth hole piped out, importunate cricket in a quarry of silences. That time I put my foot in my mouth and asked my father what it was like over there. My father's never eaten a pomegranate, though he has spent time on the other side, and its shadow darkens his return. A mama bird will chew the worm and partially digest it before spitting it out into the mouth of her young, and in this way, the baby bird is fed. My father, in Fubai, fingering the dark. I'm surprised sometimes by what comes out of my mouth, so I have to watch my tongue. Those nights, I watched my father's mouth when he dozed off in the recliner to make sure he didn't choke on his tongue during his nightly seizures. Sometimes the rot was so far advanced they had to amputate the foot to save the man. I try to swallow the truth, but still, like Cronus, it comes out of my mouth anyway. Yusuf Komunyaka returned from Vietnam and visited the memorial and wrote, "I'm stone, I'm flesh." As a defensive strategy, trenches followed a zigzag pattern and never a straight line. Back home, my father slips a hand under the lifted tongue and buffs the black leather until it shines with his reflection. And this is how he meets each week, emptied shoes laid out.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. I so rarely read that actually in readings because it's so long. So it was so nice to be able to read it.
Oh, cool. Great, great. Well, maybe we can start there. Would you talk about what that poem unlocked for you?
Absolutely. So as you know from having read it, there's a number of self-portrait poems in the book that, that for me, as the book tries to do, really try to play with that notion of the self in relation to others, right? And so much of the way that I came to know my own self and my own self as a writer was in relation to the war, in relation to my family, and in relation to this larger historical moment. But that poem in particular was really, so in some ways it's invested in that challenging the self-portrait idea, but also when I wrote it, I was experimenting with writing in ways where the poem moved along associatively as opposed to narratively, as opposed to linearly or even lyrically, and was interested in what happens if we sort of think, you know, associatively, what happens if we move, you know, maybe perhaps an image, right, takes us, you know, from moment to moment across time and space. And in that way, in its sort of movement, in its refusal to kind of be linear or even historical or narrative, it broke open for me a way to think about the book as a whole, right? And to sort of, in some ways, be very invested in thinking about a particular historical moment in my particular biography and in my father's, and to sort of break it open to think of it in a more macro way, but also in a way that was accounting for endless war and violence beyond a particular historical moment, right? And to think mythically, to think in a much broader way that didn't necessarily follow a kind of linear or logical progression. And so when I wrote that poem, I thought, oh, it was a definite departure for me aesthetically, and one that I really enjoyed doing and continue to enjoy, but I also helped me open up a way to think about the book more broadly.
Totally, totally. Yeah, there's so much. So I sort of made a list, like if this book was an archive, like some of the sort of subject file headings would be Angela Davis, self-portraiture, like you mentioned, Titus Andronicus, letters, photography, Euripides, classical Greek theater, Anne Carson, arms, the Edgewood Independent School District. It goes on and on and on and on and on. So I'm wondering, my partner is a librarian, and she's talked about the power dynamics of archives, which is such an interesting concept to me, and what gets chosen to be in the archives and what's left out, because there's no way that everything can be in the archive, even digitally. Like there is a limit, right? So how did you decide what to include in this book and what to leave out?
It's a great question. My partner's a historian, so there's a lot of discussion about archives, right? And the particular violence of archives, of archive formation, but also the particular ways that plenty of archives, right, don't get the same kind of treatment, right? That there are other archives that we may not, that elude us, that we can account for. So I think that I was first and foremost very interested in the photographic archive with regards to the Vietnam era, because of the ways that we've been conditioned to understand that moment in time, particularly through the iconic war photography or the iconic photography of that era, right? Whether it's about the Kent State Massacre or particular images from the war itself. It was a war because of the unrestricted access photographers had to combat that really shaped, at least certainly from my generation and perhaps those older, and I think it continues to shape the way we think about it. So I wanted to think about photographic archives, right, and the particular power they have in helping us understand history. And then, there were plenty of iconic photographs to choose from. So part of it was, let me just narrow things down to maybe 1970. Like, what are some ones from 1970, the year of the dog, in which I was born, and one of the ways that the year of the dog, one of the things the year of the dog refers to here. So some of it was just simply like, let me just choose a temporal boundary just to have things cohere. But then beyond that, I was very interested, at least with the iconic archive, and I'll talk about the others, to think about how women and women of color in particular were often positioned in these photographs, but also in war photography or in war archives more generally. Like, what has been the role of women or othered women, from Hecuba to Angela Davis, right? And their particular outcries against war. How are they positioned both in the photographic archive, but also in our archive itself that has been or hasn't been accounted for thus far? And then most importantly, I was interested in having us reawaken our horror to the ways we've become inured, right, in some ways, to these photographs because of the way they circulate, wanting us to reacquaint ourselves with that horror in relation to the archive, in part by kind of cutting it apart, right, and defamiliarizing ourselves with it, but also by really kind of juxtaposing it with, or interposing it with, I guess, if that's even a word, with my father's archive of the snapshots he took in Vietnam. And thinking about what happens when we turn to these communities, like, in this case, a Mexican-American immigrant and Mexican-American and Mexican immigrant communities, often poor, as my father was at the time, who have continued to be ignored, right? So it was also shaped by the fact that in the official archives, I finished this book in this sort of moment of the Ken Burns documentary, continued, like, we can't think beyond, what we've often thought about in Vietnam. And so Latinx communities and communities of color more generally really fall out of that. And given the disproportionate representation of participation in deaths by Black and Latinx, often again working class and poor communities, it seems like a crime. So my father's photographic archive became very important in interrupting our ideas and in shaping new ones for us. How I determined that also was, I really was trying to work out of an aesthetics of partiality. And by that, I mean, like, understanding, right, that this is a partial story, right? There's only so much I'm going to get, it's partial in that it's not whole, but it's also partial. It's mine, right? It's from my perspective. And I wanted to get at the fact that in as much as I'm trying to tell my father's story, I'm really telling my version of my father's story, and wanting to both account for his presence, whether I'm using his handwriting in the captions or actually showing his arm, but also but wanting to preserve and acknowledge there's only so much I can get at him or the experience, in his full subjectivity. So I never show his face because I also want to preserve his privacy. So that's another determinant, right, that happened for me.
Yeah, it's a great invitation for poets in terms of how we can do some of that work of, like, engaging with history, telling history. And I love that idea of the aesthetics of partiality, just acknowledging, like, this is a slice of history. I have, like, put these different parameters or boundaries around this project. I think this is a great book instructively for poets who are trying to write about their families. And I have a lot of students who are trying to work on, like, family poetry projects. And I think sometimes these projects can stall or fall because they can become so singularly focused on the family members or just sort of a narrow focus. So I'm wondering if you have advice for writers about how to ground family poems within a larger social context.
It's such a great question. And I think there's particular challenges, right, for those of us who are writing about historically marginalized communities, wanting to put, sort of particular kind of truths out there, but also really not wanting those particular truths or struggles to be used to reinforce particular pathologizing narratives about those communities, right? So I think that understanding, one, the risks, I think is always important, right, for all of us who are trying to do this work. I think that the advice I would offer, so one would be, one question would be, or one piece of advice I rather would be that in the whatever it is that the particular truth that you're driven to tell or called to tell, what happened, is there a corresponding poem, right, that you could write, whether that poem ends up being just pure scaffolding to the work or becomes included, that sort of literally widens the frame, widens the view of, like, let's say your perspective is, literally kind of maybe a firsthand experiential point of view, right? And so what if, to use that camera lens metaphor, what if we widen the aperture and the poem that you write is from a widened aperture that's about like this person, or even not even the person that you're writing about or the instance that you're writing about, but that particular historical moment in time. What does a poem look like that's about that? And in the writing of that poem, or even if it's just notes, whatever it ends up being, does that offer a way for us to see the particular players in this particular scene from a perspective that cannot be told from the poet's or speaker's perspective, right? And does that help us then understand the forces that formed this particular moment? Right. So I think that might be one way at it. Again, whether that becomes, because then maybe that's an exercise that helps you fold into the particular, right, those elements, or maybe it has to be a series of poems that surround it so that that moment can be understood, right, in that kind of dialectical way, right, to go totally kind of Marxian there. But I think that that's one piece of advice I would give. And the other advice I think I would give too is, I've been writing about, I wrote my first poems when I was 12 were about, the war in some ways. And I kept thinking for years and years and years, I wrote other projects and I kept thinking, I'm going to be done with this. I'm finally done talking about my dad. I'm finally done talking about the war. And here I am about to be 50. And I also realized, okay, I wasn't done with it, but I also wasn't ready before now either. So sometimes we have to be patient that the project will come when we're ready to deeply engage with the ethical and aesthetic and emotional risks that it takes, right? And questions that it propels us to ask. And when we're, I think, also capable of perhaps, narrowing and widening that aperture in our own perspective, in our own aesthetics.
Great. Yeah, that camera metaphor is so helpful. In hindsight, are you able to identify why you were ready at this point to write this book?
That's a great question. Some things were logistical, like when I was young, to speak about that archive, there was a lot of silence, as there often is among children's households that have veterans or refugees from wars. There's often a lot of silence in the house about the war, right, or the moment of trauma. And I knew as a kid on some level that all of the silence and the unspoken PTSD really, and the effects of it, I knew intuitively that it had to do with the war, but I didn't know for sure. And so I used to sneak into my dad's room and pull down this photo album that he had from the war and pore over the photos, many of which are included in the book, right? I used to pore over them thinking maybe somewhere in there will be like a key to understanding what's happening in my household. Again, it was all very kind of inchoate and intuitive at the time, but there was something about me that knew. And then many, many years went by, I didn't think about those photographs. And my mom found them within the past, let's say five years, 10 years ago, and helped me. And she was like, look, you remember all these photos your dad had? Because she knows that I love to keep the family photos. And the photos resurfaced, right? So on some level, it was also, oh, I have a relationship to these photos, and I digitized all of them. And I thought, I might want to do something with those because they mean something to me. They very much triggered my relationship to writing in some ways. So that was one thing that sort of just made me go, maybe I do need to touch that thing again, touch that wound again, so to speak. But I think other things that made me ready was a lot of work I did emotionally, both within myself and familially, like with my father, and understanding that there was a whole lot of work in our relationships, right, that had to get done. And sometimes there's opportunity for that in some families, and sometimes there's not. Sometimes there has to be estrangement and a kind of settling into an estrangement, if that has to happen, right? And, I think whatever the journey is, kind of really going, okay, I know where I am in relation to this person or this event now. And it doesn't even have to mean distance in a kind of objective, faux objective way. It just meant I understood who I was in relation to that in some ways, and so could trust that I could take on some of those challenges.
Totally, yeah, that inner work.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. To take a few steps back to the digitizing of the photos, BOA Editions did such a beautiful job with this book, and I was wondering, like, as you were working with the drafts, because there's so many images, like just on a very practical level, like on your computer, how did you sort of wrangle all of these photos and text and sort of like unconventional layouts?
So that's a great question. So first of all, Generation X fully, right? So so I really did, like, even though they were digital copies, I really did print things out and cut and paste. There was something about, even if I didn't have the original photographs, like having kind of a material engagement with them and literally kind of what it meant to tear things apart or what it meant to cut things open was really an important part of the process to then manipulate, like on a big table or on the floor. But then once, and then trying to figure out how to like make that a copy that was good enough to like then reproduce. I mean, that was somebody, I basically ended up hiring someone much younger than me to help me make sure that I could actually produce reproducible images. But I think that how I did it, I worked, which again was such a lesson for me, because I hadn't worked in images in this kind of documentary poetry way before. I put it all together as I was going, thinking, I don't even know if I'm going to be allowed to do this. I didn't ever ask permission until the very end. Like, I think that was also very important for me to go, I'm going to put these things together and hopefully they'll let me, who I didn't even know who the publisher was going to be at that point, right? Like, hopefully they will let me publish this. And it was, I think, a very important part of my process was not to be worried so much about, is this allowed or is this going to be reproducible even? Because it was just about understanding this particular process and engagement with the images was absolutely crucial to getting through the project, to getting to the next poem, or to make the poem and speak in the way that it had to speak in relation to the moment and the historical moment and the image as well. So that was also, I think, really important for me. And it wasn't until the book was accepted for publication by BOA and the editor Peter asked me, so you have permission, right, to reproduce these photos? And I said, I'll get back to you. And I started frantically calling, Getty and the AP and asking all the questions. I'm like, okay, I do this thing to this photo. There's like a sliver. Am I allowed to do this? How much does it cost? All that stuff. But that came later. And I think that was important for me because it would have certainly been devastating if I couldn't have done, reproduced all that I did. But it was also important to the process to not be bogged down in that.
Totally. I want to talk for a moment with you about the textual forms in the book. So there's self-portrait poems, ekphrastic poems, dictionary definition poems, erasures, found text, poems in the forms of walls and photographs, and then one of my favorites, a one-act play. So how do you organize a book that has so many different poetic forms?
It's a great question. So, I'm someone who I think at heart, it was funny, early on in my poetic development, I very much resisted form and formalism, certainly, early on, and then, forced myself as an exercise to kind of experiment with more received forms in particular, and then realized I loved it, and then became over time very interested in form, not just formalism, but sort of a variety of forms. And I felt that for me, the book required an engagement with the idea of the idea of form, so that it could push at its limits, and the form not just of the textual elements, right, but of genre more broadly, of the photograph, right? Like, what happens when we push against the frame of whatever it is we're in, whether it's the villanelle, whether it's a one-act play, whether it's and so for me, then, how to make that cohere, if you're using such a variety of forms, is through voice often, right? So I think voice was something I tried to do, is through series, right? So in that case, for example, there's like the idiom series, which we can talk about, that series of idiom poems, or the series that makes up the middle of the book that's addressed to Kim Phuc. So sometimes through serialization, through voice, I hoped to have a sense of coherence, but I also wanted, in some ways, the book not to cohere in a kind of productive way, like in a very purposeful way. I wanted this sense that even though we're speaking about, on the one hand, a particular moment in time, I finished that book in 2018, which in the spring of 2018 was also happened to be another year of the dog, which I didn't realize at the time until I was way in depth in writing. But also by May of 2018 was already listed as the year that suffered the highest number of school shootings in the nation's history. And so I was feeling like we're living in this unending war. And I wanted that particular historical scope to be big enough. And mostly I also wanted, our communities, and when I say our, I mean, kind of working class Black and Latino, or certainly Black Latino communities that are depicted here, refugee communities, how rarely often we're given the opportunity to be spoken about in such like a grand epic sweep, in a kind of epic way. And so I wanted that to be big, right? So that included multiple forms, it included multiple registers. And so in some ways, it's a risk, right? Because it means things can maybe not cohere as much as you want. And so it was a risk. And so sometimes maybe it is too much. And I thought, okay, well, here we go.
Well, for me, it was really one of the magical parts of the reading experience of this book it was so expansive and so exciting. I just felt like, okay, I'm ready for what's up next, but I have no idea what it will be, but I'm in. I'm totally
Thank you. Good to know. I wish all readers were as adventurous as you.
I did have a question about the idiom poems. So these poems group idioms that all share a word in common. So like the word heart, or the word arms or hands. What's the role of the idiom poems?
Thank you for that question. So just as I was attempting to do with the photographs, especially the iconic photographs, which, as I mentioned earlier, was to try to refamiliarize ourselves with images that have become so much a part of our collective memory, or images that are we've really just become so familiar with, right, that we become inured to their violence. I was wanting to do that with language, and I was wanting us to consider, like, okay, what is the most everyday, banal kind of, cliched, trite language we can think of? And it's the idiom, right? It becomes an idiom because it's so overused, right? And so I thought, what if I go to the idiom, and particular idioms that use body parts, because there's body parts all over the book, right? Both in the images and in the text. And what if I go to idioms that use body parts, and then estrange us, right, in the best possible way, from our familiarity with the idiom, to point toward how even in our most everyday language, right, we have this violence that is embedded in it, right, or that we can perhaps like see whatever might be kind of under the surface there, to sort of pull it up to the surface. So the idiom poems become a way to help foreground that Yeah, that desire to see how, the violence isn't just in the big traumatic event, right? Just as war isn't the thing that just ends in 1975, right? But it goes on and on and on, as many folks who've lived through war can speak to. And so for me, similarly with the idiom, I'm wanting to see how it's not just in our inflammatory language, but it's in the everyday.
Thanks for that. So I have two more questions. One is, in your acknowledgments, you write, formal inspirations and models, Julie Bathke introduced me to Euripides' Trojan Women when I was 12 years old and set me on this path. I'm wondering if you would be willing to share more about this part of the origin story.
Absolutely, with pleasure. Because I do think that speaking back to the first teachers we have, right, are so important. So I can speak to both Julie as a first teacher and Hecuba as a first teacher. But Julie Bathke was, I was in a public, junior high when I was, in 7th grade when I first encountered Julie Bathke, who was an amazing public school English teacher who, to this day, continues to be, long retired and as still a friend. And so it's been a real joy to kind of be in conversation. And in fact, in a recent reading I did, she pulled out like an early draft of one of my first poems that was actually about Hecuba, I think, when I wrote when I was 12. And I thought, oh my gosh, it's amazing, talk about archives. And so it's been really wonderful to kind of be in this long conversation with her, over the years. And she really was one of those teachers who, even after I was no longer a student, put the books of poetry in my hand, even before I might have been ready to read them. And then I had them on my shelf, and I still do. And it was wonderful. It's wonderful to kind of acknowledge that. But in regards to Trojan Women in particular, I think that play has been so important for me in thinking about my own formation in regards to myself as a writer, because Year of the Dog not only refers to that moment in the year of 1970 when I was born and when my father was going to war, but as a reference to Hecuba herself, which of course in the play Trojan War, we find out, right, that she's the Queen of Troy. She she's lost almost everyone in her family. And, when the war is over, the Greeks are in Trojan War, right, in the Trojan War, are there to kind of take all the women of Troy back as captives, as their sort of captive slaves, right, in their spoils of war. And she's so upset and committed to her grief over the war that she's howling and howling and howling on the ship, and howls so much that she transforms into a dog and leaps from the ship and lives out her days. This is in the story after the Trojan War play, but she lives out the rest of her days on this island in the middle of the sea, howling like a dog, or howling as a dog. And that image of Hecuba, so committed to her grief as this kind of enemy woman, right, this othered woman, saying, no, I refuse, right? In some ways, I mean, it literally transforms her beyond the human. It also is a model for me of like how women, especially those seen as the enemy or the other, she fled captivity in that commitment to grief, right? And it also says to me, right, like, here's a model of someone who's just refusing to kind of just calm down about it and be reasonable about it and say, no, this is horrifying, and I will be, mad in all the senses of the word. And so that model of a kind of feminist elegy has been really important for me in this book as well.
This is my last question. I'm wondering how your understanding of 1970 grew or changed in the course of writing this book.
Thank you for that. It's certainly, it's funny because when we think about the 60s as like the time when everything was happening, in terms of civil rights and, all these issues. But really so much of it was happening also in the early 70s, right? And thinking about it in 1970 when, they're looking back at that moment, it's, especially as I said, in this contemporary moment, thinking about school shootings, thinking about like the ways that student protests were responded to by the state, right? Like this is happening in 1970. It helped me think about that year as so pivotal in the kind of militarization of school camp, that sort of is descended upon protesters and particularly young student protesters. It helped me think about, oh, that moment is a moment in which so much of this really started happening. Or thinking about Angela Davis on the run, right? In that, and being captured and also like such a commitment to free and such a kind of a commitment to freedom, right? And that kind of tension between freedom and captivity really is sort of encapsulated in that year as well, not just through her story, but through so many. So I think those are some of the things that I became reacquainted with about that. You know, it wasn't just like, you know, Nixon doing whatever he does, you know, it was so much more.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for this interview.
Absolutely. Thank you. I loved your questions. Thank you so much. They were so engaging and thoughtful, and I really appreciate your time and care that you took with my book.
Yeah, you're welcome. And we encourage everyone listening to this to visit MiamiBookFairOnline.com. There's a whole event centered on Year of the Dog. So yeah, thank you. Yeah, and
Thank
get a copy.
you. Thank you so much, Freesia.